This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today. He's known as the blind JFK researcher, Charles Ochelli. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, The Real Deal. I'm very glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
How'd you get interested in JFK? I know that's not the only subject of your interest, but how'd you get into JFK?
Well, it's kind of an odd story. I actually, when I was graduating high school, I sought to find some assistance for schooling because of the fact that I have a bit of a disability, which is why I'm known as the blind JFK researcher. And my father had served in Vietnam and had passed away when I was a child. I wanted to, as the child of a veteran who had a disability, I was told that I could get some assistance with paying for school. And when I tried to do that, my government answered back to me and told me that there was absolutely no record of him having served in the military. And when I started to dig into his military records, I found that was absolutely the truth, that they had absolutely vaporized. And there was no way to recover them. Now, at the same time, I had always had an interest in history. And even as a child, when I was told the story about how President Kennedy had been assassinated, which was generally only explained to me in books, I would say, when I was in grammar school or middle school in a few passages, you know, the general sort of President Kennedy went to Dallas, Texas, was killed in an open car, et cetera, and generally, you know, you might even find a reference to Lee Harvey Oswald, but that was about it. But I had always found it very strange that the assassin had been killed only 2 days later while in police custody. And like I say, even as a child, I found that as odd. And when I started digging into these military records and found myself hitting this kind of wall, I ran across others who had discussed the same thing with me, were trying to help me find these records, and they were interested in the case. And it just kind of drew me in from there.
Now, Charles, just to make sure I've got this correct, you thought your father served in the military, and yet his records, when you looked into it, had seemingly disappeared?
Well, I knew he had. I had his dog tags. I had photographs of him in Vietnam. I had photographs of him in uniform. There were letters that were sent to my mother, my grandmother, my uncles, all, you know, postmarked from Vietnam that had gone through the military mail system and all that. And there was various other proofs that I had in my hand that he had been there and served. And yet my government told me there was no record of any such thing.
And yet you had his military ID. I mean, right on his dog tags, there was his military ID number.
That's correct. And though those have since been lost, to be honest with you, when I was trying to get proof, I wound up putting them in somebody's hands, and they just disappeared also. I found out very recently some interesting information about all this, and it was really, really very shocking. And I mentioned this on another show, but had not dug into it as much as I have now, and I could tell you something very, very odd now. Curiously, I mean, I've spent about 20 years studying the assassination personally. And I'm not a trained historian or a scholar of any type. I'm, you know, fairly intelligent, and therefore I have self-taught myself in a way that's kind of redundant, but I've taught myself in a way to examine certain issues, and where I did not have the academic wherewithal to do so, I tried to gain it by just simply acquiring textbooks and learning from there. For instance, you and I had an email exchange where I explained to you that I had looked into X-rays. Now, as a layman, you don't generally have a way to look at X-rays, but if you grab a textbook and you take the time to read, you know, how images are interpreted, how they're created, so on and so forth, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on if you invest the time. But anyway, when I recently found out some
But of course, you've never had the opportunity to examine any of the JFK X-rays.
Well, only the copies that were part of the House Select Committee's releases, and of course the stuff that's floated around, among researchers. I would say.
You're talking about copies that you accessed online. Yeah. Okay.
Well, yeah, stuff
Or
like
or
that.
in books. I mean, there's several. In Assassination Science, for example, David Mantik publishes several of the X-rays he was studying, and of course, in my presentations, I invariably feature several of those too. So.
Right, and also the iTech Corporation, when they did their study, they had the enhanced versions, which were released as an illustration in their studies also. Again, when you dig into these documents, you can get, fairly decent copies of a lot of things.
Okay.
For instance, we've all seen the autopsy photographs, and we know that there's only two real sources for those. I've actually gotten copies from the Fox negatives directly, but the Fox
really, how were you able to arrange that?
Well, they're in the possession of a researcher now who happens to be in New Jersey.
You're talking about Harrison Livingstone?
No, absolutely no. Actually, the person who has the negatives now is Walt Brown.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and I happen to know him, so I got the set from his copy of the negatives. So, but as you know, those were the well, we can go into that another time.
Yeah. You were telling me about trying to track your father's records and all that, and you lost the dog tags.
Oh, right.
You kept a copy of the ID number, did you not? I mean, you must have his military ID number.
Oh, yeah, but that was that's essentially his Social Security number is basically what was there with a couple of letters, I think it was. I have copies of all this stuff elsewhere, but I kind of had to stop because I hit a wall on that. Now, recently, photographs turned up, and then an individual turned up after I showed it on the internet of him standing by the Special Forces sniper school in in 67, 68. That's
So
exactly
was he in Special Forces, and was he a sniper?
It turns out that that's exactly what he was. And totally, I was completely unaware of that. He was an Army sniper, but had actually attended the school there, and I'm even having trouble nailing down exactly which school he had attended, because the guy that I was able to speak to claims to have served with him. And I always say claims because it's very hard to nail down a lot of people's claims, as you've discovered throughout the years just looking into these things. You'll find that there are various claims which can be substantiated and some that can't be. But even on a personal level, it was hard to nail this down. But meanwhile, there he is standing right in front of the SFSC. And, he was part of the 67, 68 class that graduated from that. And I think that...
So you got a photograph of him showing him in the class?
Well, he's standing in front of it with his rifle in uniform.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds like pretty good proof that he was in the military.
I would say that that's fairly decent proof, Not too many people are going to be standing
Have you been carrying this through the VA?
Well, actually, they really did not have any interest in what I was saying. They said that there was a lot of unsubstantiated claims, and a lot of records had been lost due to the fact that there had been a fire in St. Louis, which is where a lot of the records were housed. And, around the time period when my father's records would have been stored there.
Well, that doesn't seem like a very appropriate response. I mean, if records were lost, why couldn't your father's records have been among them?
Well, you're asking very much the same questions that I asked. The only difficulty was when I looked into it a little deeper, my father's records shouldn't have been stored in St. Louis because he was inducted in New Jersey. And that would have been stored at another building. There was two main facilities where these records would have been backed up, sort of, in the days of just paper records. And, the St. Louis, there was a fire in St. Louis, and that did destroy a lot of military records. And they were later recovered by going to the localized records at the bases and such. But some people's stuff had been lost in the shuffle, as is, often a problem with military records. But this has just been one very long sort of protracted attempt to get, just acknowledgement. And I tell you that, the motivation for why it is that I really have pursued this for so long, as far as the JFK stuff goes, has to do with the fact that I feel as though a serious criminal act was visited upon this country, especially, and also the people of Vietnam through that war. And I feel as though that war would not have occurred had not those shots been fired in Dallas. And I feel that the responsible parties need to be brought to justice in one way or another.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. JFK was directing that our advisors be pulled out of Vietnam, and the first action Lyndon Johnson took when he assumed the office was to reverse that National Security Action Memorandum.
Well, precisely, and if 263 had been let to stand, then all U.S. personnel, and I stress all U.S. personnel because that doesn't say all military personnel. That meant everybody would have been out of the country of Vietnam by the end of calendar year 1965, and that's directly from 263. But you're exactly correct. That was one of his very first acts as president, was to reverse that policy and send us into a war where minimally, and I do say minimally, 58,000 young men were never going to come home. At least 1 million families, by my estimation, were damaged irreparably by the fact that they ended up having either physically or spiritually or psychologically mutilated men returned to them. And that is not even to take into account the between 1, and depending on which estimate you listen to, between 1 and 4 million dead Vietnamese.
Oh, yes.
And
possibly more.
And this is an absolute crime. And again, like I say, I do believe that the first shots in the Vietnam War, the first shots of the real hard version of that war were fired in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1964.
Well, I think that's very fair. Were you ever able to get to the heart of the matter with your father? Were you ever able to figure out what happened to your father?
It is still an ongoing thing. And what makes this worse is that in 1976, he died, and it was investigated by the local police, and they ruled it a suicide.
Yeah, let's check. Let's try that. Set it up.
Now,
okay.
Unfortunately, sorry, Jim, I was a little distracted there. Unfortunately, at his death in 1976, as I said, the local authorities ruled it a suicide. But a family member hired a private investigator who discovered that he was probably not alone at the time, and the coroner ignored the fact that there were fresh ligature marks on the man's hands and feet. Not to mention the fact that he left his sister's house at 2 o'clock in the morning without his shoes or his wallet.
Well, that all is very strange and certainly not suggestive of suicide. What do you think was going on here?
Well, again, going by these very shaky sort of sources, and I mean an extremely paranoid man in his 70s now, who, like I say, claims to have served with him, he tells me that my father was involved in other operations outside of the military, and that a lot of guys had been recruited from various military outfits, and apparently, according to this man, my father's one of them, and that they were recruited for domestic operations and for some of the very same types of black operations that I've been studying for all these years, and I had no knowledge of this stuff until very recently, Jim.
Well, suppose he'd been involved in something like the Martin Luther King assassination. Is that possible? Did the timing coincide appropriately?
Well, I've been examining that, and I tell you, when I was told that there was an incident in Memphis in 1968 that my father was involved in, it's the only thing I could think of, to be honest with you. And this gentleman, without wanting to go into very serious detail, basically told me that the reason why my father had been sent to Vietnam, he wasn't even intended to be sent to Vietnam until that point, but a lot of guys who either disobeyed or were perceived as liabilities were apparently sentenced in very hot zones in Vietnam afterwards.
Yeah, to try to get rid of them by natural attrition.
Right. This
in
way,
combat, yeah.
Precisely.
Because nobody's going to question their death in combat and presume it was a murder, even if the idea was to get them into combat so they could be killed.
Precisely, and my father is an example to me, obviously, but the fact is that there are hundreds of these stories. So there really are, and
Well, there have been reports that it was an Army sniper who took out Martin Luther King.
Well, that's the thing, and the frightening thing to me was this, and I got to tell you, it's very hard for me to say this, James, because to me, I was 4 years old when I lost my father, and I had no idea of any sort of. It's hard to relate the man that I knew, the man that I have in my memory, to anything ugly.
Yeah.
So, let me try and say that I'm not saying that he was involved in that. I'm saying that it is possible, but the only thing that made me feel better is that this gentleman told me that part of the reason why he was immediately shipped to Vietnam, where he had been wounded a few times, the reason why is because he absolutely refused an order, even though he was part of a team. He refused to follow an order, and something broke down because of him, and he was sent to Vietnam.
Do you have any idea what order it was he refused?
No.
During my time in the Marine Corps, though I have been told that this is no longer the case, you're certainly lawfully entitled to refuse to obey an unlawful order. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. If you're given an unlawful order, you should refuse to obey it. So if he was given an order that he believed was unlawful, he was certainly entitled to refuse to obey it. Did you hear anything of him having been court-martialed?
Well, no. See, here's the thing. Under normal circumstances, you're absolutely correct. You're obligated, not just allowed to, but obligated to refuse an immoral order. Okay, that's what I understand about military conduct at that time, for sure. And as you said, circumstances have changed some. But to my understanding, that still stands, that you're obligated to refuse an immoral order. But
no, immoral. It's not morality. Illegal. It's an illegal order.
You know what? You're correct. I'm using the wrong word.
You could. There's supposed to be a high degree of correspondence between the legal and the moral, but unfortunately, some things are legal that are not moral, and
right.
Some things that are moral are illegal.
Exactly.
But
that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, it is. But from the point of view of the military, I would think it would have to be an illegal order, although, the fact that it's grossly immoral. If you were ordered to assassinate a political leader like Martin Luther King, that would obviously be worth refusing.
Yes, but again, I want to state that I don't have any evidence that he was involved in that. It's just that it's suggested to me that it's a possibility.
Well, look at the circumstances and the fact that all of his military records are missing and that the VA is unresponsive and that you even, that this is a very peculiar situation. This is not normal at all.
Oh, absolutely. And anybody that I've asked for help on this has basically hit a wall of non-cooperation. Even when their efforts were in the right place, when their heart was in the right place for me to try and assist me, they basically found most anybody who should be able to assist them with this within the government has been unresponsive. But this is really where the seeds of this all came from, and the idea that your government is willing to lie to you or to hide the truth is part of my life. It's not just something that I imagine as a possibility.
Oh, the government lies to us all the time. It seems most of my time these days is devoted to exposing government lies of one sort or another.
Precisely, and and sometimes it may be for a benevolent cause, but
I wouldn't count on it.
But generally, we're finding more and more that is not the case. That they're not doing this for our own good. It's not a matter of not telling us Santa Claus isn't real, so we can have a magical Christmas. Okay.
And you even believe that your father may have been murdered. I mean, it seems to me the circumstances we're talking about are very suggestive that he was involved in some domestic op, and the timing suggests if it was Memphis. I mean, it's not that you have no evidence, it's that you have circumstantial evidence.
Well, precisely, and if you imagine also the timing of his death in September of 1976, can you figure out what was going on in September of 1976? Well, I'm here to tell you, if you don't know, the preliminary investigations that were later rolled into the House Select Committee's side of the Martin Luther King assassination.
Yeah. The HSCA 76, 77, and then issued its report in 79.
Well, precisely. And then you have the fact that so many individuals had very conveniently timed deaths.
Yes.
For both investigations.
Yeah, Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, too, in relation to the HSCA. George DeMorenchild, of course, and a lot of others. Yes. There was a lot of cleaning up, tidying up, taking out people who knew too much.
And I do contend that there are a lot of people whose names you will never know. We all know about Sam Giancana, and we know about Johnny Rosselli. He's become, a figure of discussion. But I guarantee you that there were many men that were cleaned up that you will never know about. And I happen to, I'm leaning toward, I don't say that I believe, because I don't believe until I have a significant amount of evidence presented to me that is more than circumstantial. But I would say that this leads me in the direction that it's possible my father was one of them. So, I don't know.
Yes.
So,
it was 76 when he died?
Correct, September of 76.
Well, that is very, very interesting, Chuck. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, I've never actually explained all this to anybody publicly, so you're getting the first crack at this.
Well, I appreciate it, Chuck, but the circumstances are very, very disturbing.
I spend a lot of my time having to argue with individuals who are on the opposite side of this issue.
Well, I'm not sure what would be the opposite side. Anyone who doubts that Martin was assassinated by, a military FBI op. I mean, J. Edgar hated Martin Luther King and did everything he could to sabotage him.
And there's the evidence of the civil trial, which they concluded that others, not just Jowers there, but others, including individuals from the government, had certainly.
And then going in and cutting down all the brush and shrubbery where there might have been residue of a sniper and all that.
Exactly.
And, he was being hassled politically for staying at a decent hotel where there would have been good security, and into moving into a black-owned hotel where there was minimal security. I mean, this was very contrived.
Yeah, the efforts to push him into the Lorraine motel, simply because you stayed at a white-owned place the last time you were here. You should stay at a good black establishment. He was being pressured for, appearance's sake.
He was being set up
into a much less secure area. And I'm not an expert on the MLK case by any means, but I have familiarity with it enough to know that was definitely a contrivance where he was positioned to be vulnerable for sure. And, the fact that they took off a bunch of guys that would have been his personal security, who voluntarily would have helped to protect Dr. King while he was there. And there was maneuvers made where they told them that there was threats against their own lives. It was a police officer who had been there, who would have been an excellent protector of his, that was taken out of position, and others that were taken out of position and would have.
Well, we have more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting JFK up for the hit, and one of them was moving his military aide from the front seat, where he would have been in between Greer and Kellerman, to one of the very last vehicle in the motorcade, where the bullet that hit Jack in the throat passed through the windshield. Had he been there, it would have hit him, not hit Jack. I mean, all these things were going on.
Well, not to mention the fact that the night before you have, these guys drinking hard liquor until, 5 in the morning?
Chuck, we're going to take our first break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Charles Ochelli. We've been talking about his father, who may or may not have been involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King, and now we're turning. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing my conversation with Charles Ochelli. Chuck, tell us about then how you got going into JFK. I mean, your dad's case is pretty fascinating all by itself.
Yeah, definitely a subject that bears examination, and we could probably spend 2 hours on that alone.
Yeah.
Something, though, as you were discussing the Secret Service, I recalled the fact that you've often brought up the destruction of the Secret Service records when the ARB was about ready to request them, and then they started destroying them before the members could even be appointed to the board. Well, this is kind of a hopeful little update for you. I know you probably read the Kennedy Detail, the Gerald Blaine book.
Yeah, I have the book.
Okay, well, I read it as well, and another researcher named William Kelly, had happened to read it and realized the same thing that I did, which was that Gerald Blaine is describing in there that he had personally some of the copies of some of those records that had been destroyed in his possession. And William Kelly notified the National Archives, and now Blaine turned over some of those records which were presumed destroyed and lost. So some of those records have been recovered now.
Well, that's pretty damn interesting. Of course, I mean, they'll make it obvious that the detail in Dallas was completely non-standard and didn't follow the established operating procedures. It's I don't think anyone's going to have any surprise. But the fact that was stunning was that they destroyed the records instead of responding to the request.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, I think this will shed some light once these things are available to us through the archives. I think this will shed some light as to why some of those things were destroyed, because Blaine was part of the advance for the next city, I believe, at the time. I'm going from memory now. It's probably been like a year since I read the book, but I think he was part of the advance for the next city, and was definitely involved in that. And whatever records he had from his shift reports and all that kind of stuff should definitely give us some indication as to why that stuff was being destroyed. Don't you think?
Yeah. I think so too. Yes.
And,
that's very good, and good for Bill Kelly. He and I have sometimes had differences in point of view, but this is certainly commendable on his part.
Oh yeah, I was very happy that he did that. I mean, I realized it, and then, to be honest with you, did not even think to do that because, as you know, the records that were in government hands and private hands that pertain to the assassination were all by law, because this is a law that still exists on the books now, that you're supposed to turn all this stuff over. So Blaine, having held his own copies of these reports and such, is definitely relevant, and he should have turned those things over, which now he has. But without the mechanism of the board to enforce the JFK Records Collection Act, it's rather difficult, and it's almost been set to like a voluntary kind of situation, because there's no way to enforce. Even if they demand records from you or me that we have, there's no way that they can really enforce the collection of them.
But you're saying Blaine did voluntarily turn them over?
Blaine apparently has voluntarily turned them over to the new person that's in charge over there at Archives too. So when those things, it takes time after things are turned over to them. They have to, file them and go through that process.
I think the fact that we have, 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit is just as telling as the discovery that all 4 of the crash sites on 9/11 were fabrications. I mean, this is extremely damaging to the government's account. In fact, the fabrication of the 4 crash sites makes it hopelessly untenable. It demonstrates conclusively that the government's whole story of 9/11 is a myth from beginning to end. What we have with the Secret Service in all of its forms of dereliction of duty, including leaving 2 agents behind at Love Field, having all the vehicles in the wrong sequence with the president out front when he should have been in the middle, canceling the flatbed truck that should have carried the reporters and photographers right in front of the presidential limousine, cutting the motorcycle escort down to 4, instructing them not to ride above the rear wheels, not welding the manhole covers, not covering the open windows, allowing the crowd to spill 8 to 10 out into the street, ordering the 112th Military Intelligence Unit, which should have been distributed through the city for crowd control, to stand down over the adamant opposition of its commanding officer, having an improper motorcade route that, of course, was changed just 4 days before, the event when the Secret Service never changes a motorcade route because they have to inspect every building and every occupant of every building to make sure there's no threat to the president. Where the Secret Service records show there was supposed to be no threat to JFK within 500 miles of Dallas, which is one of the manifest absurdities I've ever heard about this case. Clearly, they've been sanitized for that purpose. Then taking a 110-degree turn from Houston on to Elm, Greer actually pulls the limousine to a halt after bullets began to be fired to make sure JFK will be killed. Then when they get to Parkland and witnesses observe the bullet hole in the windshield, they move it where no one can see it. It's sent back to Ford Motor Company on Monday, the day of the formal state funeral, stripped down to bare metal, rebuilt, replacing the windshield. We've even tracked down the official who replaced the windshield and confirmed it had a through-and-through bullet hole. Then Killerman picks up both X-rays, exposed and developed, but the autopsy photographs exposed but not developed. And the next time they turn up, they have been altered, faked, or changed. I mean, David W. Mandick, MD, PhD, has now gone into the National Archives, maybe as many as 9 times, as they cover all of the X-rays in the archives, Chuck, that are supposed to be originals are not. None of them. Not one of the X-rays he's examined is an original JFK X-ray.
Well, Mantic's work on this, unfortunately, I can't reproduce it. But that's because the fact is that not too many people are allowed to even get a look at those X-rays to begin with, because the control of the autopsy materials has been in the hands of the Kennedy family from day one, which is pretty strange in any sort of homicide situation. Mantic did the work with the
optical
measuring the optical density, basically figuring out how much light is traveling through the X-rays. But then the oddity that he came up with that letter T laying on its side is absolutely bizarre.
Very good, Chuck. You're right on top of this. That's great. It's a pleasure.
Because he sees that there is absolutely no